Charles Bronson sat in a leather chair in a Beverly Hills office, listening to a studio executive explain why he needed to sign the contract in front of him. The role was perfect, an action thriller, a tough guy getting revenge. Exactly the kind of character that had made Bronson one of the highest paid actors in the world. The studio was offering $12 million for one film. $12 million in 1987 money. Adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $30 million today. It was more money than Bronson had earned in his entire career up to that point. All he had to do was sign. Charles picked up the script. He read the first 10 pages. Then he closed it, looked the executive in the eye, and said for words that stunned everyone in the room, "I can't do this." The executive laughed, thinking it was a negotiation tactic. $15 million, then that's our final offer. Charles stood up. "You don't understand. There's no amount of money that would make me do this film." And he walked out. What happened in that room reveals more about who Charles Bronson really was in any movie he ever made. This is the story of the day Hollywood's toughest man drew a line in the sand and refused to cross it, no matter the cost. To understand why Charles Bronson walked away from $12 million, you need to understand how he got to that point in his career. By 1987, Charles Bronson was 66 years old. He had been making movies for over 35 years. He'd survived the coal mines, World War II, decades of poverty and rejection. He'd finally achieved success in his 50s with the Death Wish franchise, becoming an international superstar. He had money, he had fame, he had security. Everything he'd spent his life fighting for, he had finally won. The Death Wish films had made Bronson a cultural icon. The character Paul Kersey, a mild-mannered architect turned vigilante after his wife is murdered and daughter assaulted, resonated with audiences in the 1970s and 80s. People felt unsafe in their cities. Crime was rising. The justice system seemed broken. And Paul Kersey represented a fantasy. What if one man could fight back? What if violence could solve the problem of violence? The films were controversial. Critics hated them, calling them fascist, reactionary, dangerous. Audiences loved them. Death Wish spawned for sequels. And Charles Bronson played Paul Kersey in every single one. But something happened to Charles between Death Wish in 1974 and Death Wish V in 1994. The man who had embraced the vigilante role in his 50s started questioning it in his 60s. Partly it was personal growth. Partly it was tragedy. In 1984, his wife Jill Ireland was diagnosed with breast cancer. Charles spent the next 6 years caring for her, watching her fight and slowly lose that fight. In 1989, his adopted son Jason died of a drug overdose. In 1990, Jill died. Within 6 years, Charles lost the two people he loved most in the world. That kind of loss changes a person. It makes you rethink everything. Your priorities, your values, what really matters. After Jill's death, Charles barely worked. He turned down most film offers. When he did accept roles, it was purely mechanical. Show up, say the lines, collect a check, go home. The passion was gone. The drive was gone. He was just going through the motions. But in 1987, before Jill's death but during her illness, something happened that forced Charles to confront what his career had become and what it meant. A major studio. The name was never publicly revealed, but insiders say it was either Paramount or Warner Brothers, approached Charles with a script. It was called The Cleaner. The premise was simple. A former CIA assassin comes out of retirement to take revenge on the people who killed his family. Standard action thriller formula. But the script had a twist. The violence was extreme, even by Death Wish standards. Graphic torture scenes, prolonged suffering, detailed descriptions of how the protagonist would make his victims beg for death. The script read less like an action movie and more like a sadistic revenge fantasy. The studio loved it. They thought it was a natural evolution of the Death Wish franchise. Audiences wanted harder, darker, more extreme. Look at what was succeeding at the box office. Rambo, Commando, movies where the hero killed dozens, sometimes hundreds of people without consequences. The Cleaner would push those boundaries even further. And they wanted Charles Bronson to star. Because if Charles Bronson did it, it would be legitimate. He was a vigilante. He was a man audiences trusted to deliver righteous violence. The offer was unprecedented. $12 million up front, a percentage of the box office, total creative control over action sequences, first-class travel, the best trailer, everything an actor could want. For Charles, who had spent the first 40 years of his life in poverty, who had worked in coal mines for pennies, $12 million was an incomprehensible amount of money. It was generational wealth. It was security for his children, his grandchildren. It was everything he'd fought for his entire life. But Charles read the script, and he couldn't do it. It wasn't just that the violence was extreme. Charles had made violent movies before. Death Wish was violent, but there was always a moral framework. Paul Kersey didn't enjoy killing. He did it because the system failed him. There was a justification, however questionable. But The Cleaner was different. The protagonist enjoyed the violence. He took pleasure in making people suffer. There were scenes where he smiled while torturing victims, where he made jokes while killing them. It was cruelty for cruelty's sake. Entertainment violence stripped of any moral complexity. Charles thought about his career. He thought about the Death Wish films and how they'd been criticized for glorifying vigilantism. He'd always defended them by saying they were about justice, about a man pushed beyond his limits. But was that true? Or had he been part of creating something darker? Something that told audiences that violence was a solution, that killing was satisfying, that revenge was righteous? He thought about Jason, his son, who had died of a drug overdose 2 years earlier. Jason had struggled with addiction, with anger, with a sense that the world was violent and cruel, and you had to be harder than it was to survive. Had Jason watched his father's movies and learned the wrong lessons? Had the Death Wish films, with their message that problems could be solved with gun, contributed to a culture that glorified violence and made young men like Jason feel that strength meant being willing to hurt people? Charles couldn't answer those questions definitively, but sitting in that office, holding that script, he knew he couldn't make The Cleaner. Not for $12 million. Not for any amount of money. Because if he did, he would be saying that money mattered more than principle, that his image mattered more than his values, that success mattered more than the legacy he left behind. The studio executive couldn't understand. Charles, it's $12 million. For 3 months of work. You're 66 years old. How many more opportunities like this are you going to get? Charles looked at him and said something that the executive would later repeat to reporters. I've spent my whole life surviving. I survived the coal mines. I survived the war. I survived Hollywood. I'm not going to destroy what I survived for just because someone waves money at me. The executive tried another approach. Think of it as just entertainment. It's not real. Nobody thinks action movies are real. But Charles shook his head. People do think they're real. Not literally, but emotionally. They internalize the message. They learn from what they watch. I've spent 20 years playing a man who solves problems with violence. I don't know if that was right or wrong, but I know I can't make it worse. I know I can't make a movie where the hero enjoys killing, where suffering is entertainment. I just can't do it. The studio was furious. They'd already announced the project. They'd built their marketing campaign around Charles Bronson. They threatened legal action, though they had no grounds. They tried to negotiate, offer more money, better terms, anything to change his mind. But Charles was immovable. He had made his decision. And once Charles Bronson made a decision, nothing could change it. Word spread through Hollywood quickly. Charles Bronson had turned down $12 million on principle. Some people respected him for it. They saw it as a man taking a moral stand, refusing to compromise his values even when it cost him everything. But others mocked him. They said he was a hypocrite. He'd made a career playing violent characters. And now suddenly he had standards? They said he was finished, washed up, using morality as an excuse because he knew his career was ending anyway. The truth was somewhere in between. Charles wasn't a hypocrite. He was evolving. He was a man in his 60s who had lost his wife and son, who was facing his own mortality, who was asking himself what his life had meant and what he would leave behind. And he decided that leaving behind one more ultra-violent movie, even for $12 million, wasn't worth it. But the decision had consequences. The Cleaner was eventually made with a different actor. It was a moderate success. Charles never saw it. After turning down the role, other major studios became hesitant to offer him leading roles. They saw him as difficult, as someone who might turn down projects at the last minute. His asking price dropped. The quality of scripts he received declined. By the early 1990s, Charles was doing direct-to-video action movies, low-budget productions that went straight to VHS rental stores. Some people saw this as proof that he'd made the wrong decision. If he'd just taken the $12 million, he could have retired comfortably. Instead, he was working for a fraction of that amount in movies nobody watched. But Charles didn't see it that way. In one of his rare interviews in the early 1990s, a reporter asked if he regretted turning down The Cleaner. Charles thought for a moment, then said, "I regret a lot of things in my life. Marriages that failed, time I didn't spend with my kids, roles I took that I shouldn't have. But turning down that movie? No, that's one thing I don't regret, because I can look at myself in the mirror and know I didn't sell my soul. And that's worth more than $12 million. The story of Charles Bronson and The Cleaner reveals something fundamental about success and compromise. Hollywood is built on compromise. Actors compromise their artistic integrity for commercial success. They take roles they don't believe in because the paycheck is good. They promote products they don't use. They say things they don't mean. It's part of the business. And most people accept it as necessary. But every so often, someone draws a line. Someone says, "This far and no further." Charles Bronson drew that line in 1987. He said there were things more important than money, more important than fame, more important than success. Things like integrity, like being able to sleep at night, like leaving behind a legacy you're not ashamed of. Was Charles Bronson right to turn down $12 million? There's no objective answer to that question. His family might have preferred he take the money. His financial advisors probably thought he was crazy. But Charles made a decision for himself, based on his own values, his own conscience, his own understanding of what mattered, and he lived with the consequences without complaint. In his final years, Charles Bronson lived quietly. He remarried in 1998 to Kim Weeks. He rarely gave interviews. He didn't attend Hollywood events. He just lived, far from the spotlight, content with his choices. When he died in 2003 at age 81, the obituaries focused on his iconic roles, his tough guy image, his status as an action star. Few mentioned The Cleaner or the $12 million he turned down, but those who knew the story understood its significance. Charles Bronson had spent his entire life fighting to survive, to succeed, to prove that a poor kid from the coal mines could make it in the most glamorous industry in the world. And when he finally achieved that success, when he had the opportunity to cash in one final time for an amount of money that would have set up his entire family for generations, he said no, because the cost wasn't just financial. The cost was his integrity. And Charles Bronson had learned, through decades of hardship and loss, that integrity was the one thing you couldn't afford to lose. The lesson of Charles Bronson's decision isn't that money doesn't matter. Money matters. Charles knew that better than most people. He'd lived without it. He'd struggled for it. He'd earned it. But he also knew that money is just a tool. It's not an end in itself. And if you sacrifice your principles to get it, you lose something that money can't buy back. Today, in an era where everything seems to be for sale, where influencers promote products they don't use, where celebrities endorse politicians they don't believe in, where artists compromise their vision for commercial success, the story of Charles Bronson turning down $12 million feels almost quaint, but it also feels necessary. It's a reminder that some things can't be bought. Some lines shouldn't be crossed. Some compromises aren't worth making. Charles Bronson made violent movies. He made a lot of them. Some people think those movies glamorize violence and contributed to a culture that sees guns as solutions to problems. Charles wrestled with that question himself, especially in his later years. But what The Cleaner incident shows is that he wasn't blind to those concerns. He wasn't just a mercenary actor taking whatever role paid the most. He thought about what his work meant. He questioned whether he was contributing something positive or negative to the world. And when faced with a role that crossed his personal line, he walked away. That doesn't absolve him of responsibility for the films he did make. It doesn't mean the Death Wish franchise was unproblematic, but it does show that Charles Bronson was more than just his image. He was a man capable of growth, of self-reflection, of making difficult choices based on principle rather than profit. And in an industry built on compromise, that's rare. That's worth remembering. If you're facing a decision where money is pulling you one way and your values are pulling you another, remember Charles Bronson in that Beverly Hills office in 1987. Remember that he had every reason to take the $12 million. He'd earned it. He deserved it. Nobody would have blamed him. But he looked at that script, looked at his reflection in the window, and decided that some things matter more than money. He decided that being able to respect yourself when you wake up in the morning is worth more than any amount of dollars in the bank. And he lived the rest of his life without regret, knowing he'd made the right choice. That's not just toughness. That's wisdom. That's courage. That's what real strength looks like when nobody's watching.